Hey guys, I'm Tanner with Woodgrain. We're gonna show you how to install Shiplap. So, this is a pretty straightforward video. We do a lot of different videos. We have a library of videos on showcasing different accent walls using our moldings and showcasing how to transform a room from something super basic to really any design style, from colonial to modern to farmhouse, etc. So this is a shiplap tutorial specifically. Shiplap's pretty interesting in the fact that there's a lot of different types of shiplap. There's tongue and groove shiplap. You've probably heard this term if you're familiar with shiplap. But essentially, you can kind of imagine two boards. Your top board having a notch grooved out that fits the next piece so it's seamless and it kind of leaves that gap. On this one, we did a tutorial on essentially just board, S4S board, and we did our own gap. Obviously, it's a little bit more work, but if you can't find tongue and groove shiplap, or if it's more expensive, this would be a pretty easy replacement. Let's talk about the steps we took to install it. So there's 5 simple steps that we always talk about in the process. So the first is planning. So really determine where you're gonna be putting the shiplap. This room, I don't know if you can see it, but it's broken up by a countertop, so we have the top and bottom. So we determined that we're gonna do the full wall with shiplap. So the other piece of that is deciding what material you're gonna be using. So we determined that we wanted a specific size of board and determine how much of that we were gonna need. So in your planning stage, it's always kind of nice to know your theme, what the look of the room you're gonna be going for, and that will help you determine kind of how that's gonna lay up. We wanted this to be pretty simple, kind of almost a farmhouse type-esque feel. So that was kind of our planning stage. I always recommend, if it's pretty elaborate and detailed, to draw it out on a piece of paper and kind of put all your notes into that. Second stage is measuring. So we had to measure the length of our wall by the height to determine the amount of materials we're gonna need, if there's gonna be any breaks. Luckily, we had a shorter wall, so we were able to use full boards rather than having to pieces and kind of do miter seams and whatnot for the joints. So up to this point, we've really just done the measuring and determining how much wood we're gonna need. So we cut our first board, made sure it fit properly and it was nice and snug. We didn't have too many gaps on either side. That was done perfectly. The biggest challenge we're gonna have with this project is the light socket. So this is really straightforward. We're not, like I mentioned, we're not mitering joints together. We're not joining molding seams or anything like that. But we have an outlet here that we're gonna have to work around. I don't wanna cut it and essentially glue or nail gun pieces of wood around it. I wanna cut a hole in the molding so it looks clean and consistent. So one thing we have is a multi-tool. I'd recommend this as far as cutting the molding itself. Pretty straightforward. There's a lot of different extensions. So essentially what we did, we have a really precise fit here. We'll putty and caulk and sand this off, but essentially I took off the light socket here and use that as my template to know exactly the dimension of what I needed to cut. So I determined it needed to be 2.5 inches up, is where the start of the light socket was, and I determined that it was gonna be about, I wanna say 20 if I recall right. It was gonna be 17 inches in as far as the start of the light socket outlet, and I essentially took that off, traced it around my board. I used my multi-tool and essentially knocked out that piece, and so we are off to the races. So we've already talked about the different types of shiplap. Essentially, we're not using traditional shiplap here. We're not using the tongue and groove pre-fabbed shiplap. So the pros of this, we can actually decide the size of our gap. If we want to go wider, if we want to go narrower, we can kind of determine, we're going to eye it. So I've been playing around a little bit. I don't want to go too big, just the fact that we have a textured wall in the back and we didn't do backer board or anything like that. So I don't want to be able to see this textured wall on the back. I'm actually going to use this paint stick here. So this is going to be our spacer for the shiplap. I'm going to use this. I'm going to insert it to make sure that I get it consistent. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna run my nail gun with this as I go down. I'm gonna start on one side and I'm just gonna run this along the whole thing as I start nailing. So that is how we're gonna do our spacing. So really there's only 2 sizes of board. We have an 80 3/4 size board that's gonna go here. So I essentially determined that I'm gonna need 12 boards for this wall. And underneath is 52 inches and 1/3 as well. I essentially pre-cut all of our wood. I had a template. I used the same cut over and over, and that's gonna make it easier not have to go in and out of the house or back into the garage and make my cuts. So all my wood's ready. My nail gun's ready. Now I can just power through and get this all installed on the wall. Pretty straightforward. So this is one of the easiest accent walls, just the fact that everything's standardized, everything's essentially the same consistency, and we can just plug and play and get cracking on it. So guys, we just wrapped up the third step in the process. So up to this point, we've done our planning, we've done our measuring, and then the installation. This part is probably one of the most important parts. We're gonna do our finishing. So when it comes to shiplap, obviously we have the gap, so we're not gonna have to do any caulking right there, but we'll do our outside seams. Rather than doing caulking in the nail holes that typically sinks, we like to do putty, any type of wood putty, all-purpose putty, and then we'll go back and sand this all down before we go paint. So this process isn't too bad. So the last thing we're gonna do here is we're actually gonna use a silicone caulking for the countertop. So where the countertop meets the shiplap, we're going to use a silicone caulking just to make sure that we don't get water and have mold or anything like that. So everywhere else we'll use standard, there's a bunch of different companies that do it, but so we're just going to use white base trim molding caulking. Let's go for it. So quick tip for caulking to make it easier, we like to cut this at a 45-degree angle to make sure that we have easy application. Caulking gun's always nice. Have water in a towel with you as well so you can wipe off the excess. So finishing is pretty key in this process. You can really cover up a lot of imperfections and blemishes. Spend some time in this process. The other thing you're going to want to do is sand. So after you get your putty on and fill those nail holes, go back over sandpaper using typically like 220 grit. We used a hand palm sander and got rid of those imperfections and got us ready for the fifth step, which is painting. So this wall specifically painted, we did a white traditional type look. We did 2 coats. The fact that it wasn't a primed board, if you have a primed board you might have to do 2 coats, but this was pretty straightforward. And really when it comes to painting, you want to make sure you mask everything off, your countertops, your ceilings, because you will get overspray. We did a sprayer on this. With spray, I would say you want about 1.5 foot, about 1 foot from the wall, so you don't get any overspray or bleed and kind of get drips from the overspray. So if you're using a hand roller or a paintbrush, kind of the same process. Make sure you mask everything off and spend the time to get those corners and cracks and some of the underbelly of those moldings. So I hope this was educational, informational for you guys. For all things doors and molding, make sure you follow us at We Are Woodgrain. Please subscribe and like this video, and go check out some of our other videos that we have. We have a library of other pretty interesting accent walls. This one's a little bit more basic but timeless, and yeah, thanks for following along.